I says, I says, I don't know that much. I said, but I do know that if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. When you take a life, that you're going to go to hell.
Friends, inquisitive friends are asking me what's come over me. A change, there's been a change, and it's oh so plain to see.
Hello, I'm Ruth Ann Leelisher, and you're watching Damascus Roads. The Mongols Motorcycle Club is one of the biggest and strongest in the nation. Andy Holguin was just a kid who was raised in East LA who joined the club and later rose in power to become the Mongols' national president. This is Andy's story.
I grew up in East LA. We lived together, 5 brothers and sisters. Well, my mom, we were very close with my mom, and my dad was not around too much because he did work a lot. And when I got about 12 years old, that's when things started getting rough at home because all of a sudden my parents started having major problems. Around that time I started going out and I started to learn how to dance. I became a real good dancer and was always getting in dance contests. It helped me to get away from the problems that I was having at home. There was a lot of fighting and drinking going on for a couple of years there, and then finally my dad moved out. They got divorced. After my dad had remarried, I went to go visit him, and my mother had taken me to leave me off there. I'll never forget this. I was about 15 years old, and she left me off, and I went in, and the lady opened the door for me, and she had made some dinner for me, and I sat down, and while I'm eating, I hear this big crash, and my mother broke the door in, and she wanted to beat up this lady, which was my stepmother, and I wouldn't let her. I grabbed her by the wrist. I was scared, and I wouldn't let her beat her up, so automatically I became the villain, and my mom turned on me, and she left that day, which was on a Saturday, but on Sunday, when I went home, she was waiting for me on the porch. She was drinking a beer, and as I came walking up, she said, "What do you want here?" So go back to that woman. You're more concerned about her, and you protected her. And all of a sudden, a rage came up in her, and she slapped me. And I told her, I says, I got angry. I says, "I hope you rot." And I went to go stay at my grandmother's. And we didn't talk for 2 months. And my mother ended up dying. It was a big turning point, I believe, in my life. After that incident, we gathered up my brothers and sisters. I was 16. We did, had the funeral, had the services. I remember it was very difficult for me to cry because my mom was the type of person who used to say, when I die, don't cry for me. Bring me a 6-pack of beer right now while I'm alive, And so those kind of things stayed with me, and it was very difficult, though. My grandmother and I, we started to try to raise my brothers and sisters. I didn't know how to deal with the responsibility. And my father came, he wanted to help, but he was already starting another family. And my brothers and sisters went through a lot of struggles. In the meantime, I'm still trying to be a teenager growing up. Car club era was just starting. Car club things, we had a little clique called the Whittier Boulevard Boys on Whittier Boulevard. And then the Midnighters made a song, Whittier Boulevard, and that just was an explosion.
Let's take a trip down Whittier Boulevard.
And next thing you know, people are cruising as bumper to bumper up and down the boulevard, and car clubs started popping up all over the place, and guys started fixing up their cars with hydraulics, and they were putting the best that they could to at that time. People were going to TJ to get their interior done, and there's some guys that started painting really good, doing graphics and those kind of things. And spoke rims were really popular then. If you had spoke rims, it was a big thing, and people were coming from all over. And of course, you started to have fights. And after a while, the violence started to escalate. And In those days, people would fight with bumper jacks and crowbars, and getting stabbed with a broken bottle was very common in those days. It happened to me. I got rolled around one day on the floor. In a blink of an eye, all of a sudden, I was against the wall, and there was these guys that were hitting me, and I felt something warm, but it didn't hurt. And I kept swinging, and all of a sudden, my arms got heavier and heavier, and I fell. And when I fell, I could hear what was going on, and they literally wanted to tie me to the bumper of their cars and drag me down the alley. That's when these other guys pulled up, and they jumped out with crowbars and bumper jacks. Well, one guy picked me up, but as this guy was picking me up, one of the guys that came to help me swung the bumper jack and hit me on the knee and tore a chunk of my knee out with a piece of bone. Next thing you know, I woke up in a cop car with a bunch of handkerchiefs on my stomach. I had gotten stabbed, and they took me in, and I got stitched up a little bit, and I believe I survived because those guys pulled in right at the right time. My thing was not violence. I didn't want to fight, but out there, when you start drinking and you start partying, it becomes part of it. And during that time, I went to a bike shop in La Puente, and I happened to look in the back there, and there was this guy that was sitting there, and he had a jacket on. And I was looking at these guys who were around him, and I saw him, and I asked the guy, I says, "Hey, isn't that Louis?" And they go, "Oh yeah, that's Prez Louis." I says, "Prez Louis?" I go, "Yeah, that's Louis, you know, he's from the Mongols." And I walked back over there, and I said, "Hey, what's going on?" And as I started to get near him, all these guys lunged forward like, you know, "What are you doing?" And I'm looking at these guys like, what's their trip? I didn't know anything about bikers, about, you know, presidents or officers and all that. And all of a sudden, you know, he told him, he goes, "Hey, this guy's all right." And we hugged, and we started talking, and he started telling me that they had this club, and there was a few other guys that we used to run together when we were in a car club. And I asked him, I says, "What do you got to do to get in your club?" They go, "Well, you got to prospect." I said, "Well, what's prospecting?" They go, "Well, you know, you got to earn your way in, you got to serve the guys, you know, they just do whatever they tell you to do." That sounds easy enough. I didn't know what I was getting into. You had to light cigarettes, and somebody wanted a beer, you got to give them a beer. But there was also some tough things that you had to do. If there was a bar fight, you better be in there. If you've seen a brother that was outnumbered or whatever, you better be in the middle of it, taking care of business and stuff like that. And there was a lot of us that used to live up to that sex, drugs, and rock and roll image. Some of us were bullies. Some of us did things that, you know, after a while that you didn't want that type of person around. In the old days, we used to run out, you know, you didn't go anywhere without a sleeping bag. Wherever you ended up, that's where you threw your sleeping bag down. You always had, you know, at least 500-600 cases of beer. You know, we'd have food and we'd have partying and everything that, you know, just go out there and let your hair down. You rode hard. You know, a lot of guys had jobs, but it was easy, just your job, you know what, I'm not going to work tomorrow. We'll stay an extra day and party. And so going on runs was really a good time. Of course, there was confrontations with legendary clubs, and some heavy things happened. There's been books written about it. It's been in the papers and all that, and a lot of violence started to take place. I started coming up in the ranks, and I finally became president of the club, national of all the club, the whole organization. It's awesome to be going down the road, and you look in your mirror and you see 100, 150 set of handlebars in your mirror. Something happens to you inside. It's one thing to ride in the pack. It's something else to be in the head of the pack. Had a little number 1 on my glasses. Number 1. It was even funny, one time I got arrested, and they called to see if they had me in custody. And the bailiff says, "Oh yeah, we got number 1 here." And that was awesome to, you know, even law enforcement is acknowledging who you are. But when you are number 1, there's also going to come a time that you're going to realize your responsibility, your accountability. And that's, for me, that was a turning point. Because when the conflicts came and the confrontations came with the legendary clubs, 2 brothers got killed. They were blowing off their motorcycles. At the funeral, we're going to have the wake, and the night of the wake, the funeral home gets blown up. All of a sudden, it wasn't important being the president and being the head, and being all these things that you believe you are. All of a sudden, the conviction hit me. Felt guilty, felt responsible. Something started to break inside of me at that time. The reality that innocent people, family members, were going to have to suffer. And it got pretty hairy. There was times that you had to stick your hand inside your window of your vehicle and turn the key and hope that it didn't blow up. Now, there was more attention being drawn to us by law enforcement. As far as a position, they knew I was the president of the club. They also believed that I was a hitman, a known hitman for the club. At that time, PCP was starting to come out and started getting caught up in PCP. Heroin was a no-no. Heroin was a no-no. As far as we were concerned, a hype was the worst thing you could be. Physically, I was trying to push myself, and I was drinking a lot and not getting rest, and there was a breakdown that started happening this time. I started getting paranoid. Pretty soon I didn't trust anybody. I was having difficulties in my marriage, my relationships with my wife, my kids, family, worried about them. Just all these things were going on at one time. It wasn't uncommon for my son and my daughter to see automatic weapons in our house. My wife used to answer the door with a shotgun. I have a younger brother. He had gone to the service. He came home on leave, and they had a party for him, and he had asked me if I would come and be a bouncer there at the party, and I told him no, because the guys that were where we lived at that time, I didn't get along too good with them. So as the party went on, some guys came and they pretty much wanted to take over the party. So I had already been taking some pills and drinking some tequila. Well, I got my gun and decided to go over there. A couple of these guys from the street gang said they were taking over the party. And I just reached in my back pocket, pulled out my .38 and shot him. And they grabbed him. There was about 200 people there in the party, and they started to walk down the driveway. And as they were going out toward the street, they said, "We'll be back." And I said, "No, you won't." And I started firing at them. And they got their artillery, and we had a shootout there. And there's like 200 people trying to scatter, run all over the place. And I went to court, and I was convicted for shooting this guy. And during that time, I started dealing drugs. Pretty soon I started snorting a little bit. After a while, I started fixing, and I became a heroin addict. I became what I hated the most. Then I didn't want to see any of my club brothers. I didn't want to see anybody. I was ashamed of what I became. My story is a story about a professional failure. Failed as a husband, failed as a father, failed as a friend, as an employee, failed as a club brother. And so I was dealing with all this failure. And then I became really scandalous. When you become a hype, you become scandalous. Everything revolves around your addiction. And shame came with that, a lot of shame. And I couldn't look at my kids face to face. Couldn't look at my family members, my wife. My wife said, she finally says, "You know what?" She says, I won't live like this anymore. I'll put up with a lot of other stuff, you know. I was abusive with her physically, and I was unfaithful, a lot of things. But she says, against that drug, I can't compete against that drug. And she says, I refuse to live this way anymore. And I promised her that I was going to try to change and all that. And she says, no, this time I don't even want to listen to you, because every time I do, you pick me up and you drop me. You pick up the kids, you drop them, you know. And she says, you need to see yourself. So I got a year in the county jail and 5 years probation. And I did half of the time. My wife wrote a letter to the judge, and I told her, don't write a letter to them. I said, they're not going to let somebody with a record like mine out. Well, sure enough, the judge let me out. And the first thing I did was go and fix. First thing I did. And just the whole cycle started again. And I remember that I found out where she lived at. And I went to her house, and I asked if I could stay there. And she says, all right. She says, but don't think anything's going to happen. I said, I know. And she said, I feel sorry for you. Well, the little bit of pride that I still had, I got up and I says, you know what? I said, I'm not a dog for you to feel sorry for. And I walked out the door. And as I was walking up the street, it's like a voice showed me, you are that dog. Because I told her, I says, you feel sorry for the dog that got hit by a car that's laying on the side of the curb. I says, don't feel sorry for me. But yet when I walked out of her house, I started thinking about that. And it's like something said, you are that dog on the side of the curb. And that's when I cried out to God. I said, God, if you're real, you got to do something with me. Because I don't know if I'm going to be able to control my next thought. And I'd rather die than go on living without all my senses. The next day, I was supposed to go turn myself in for under the influence. I had made a deal to do 2 years so that it would run with my probation violation. I went to court, and the attorney that we had at that time had already appeared at court, and they wouldn't take me into custody. They had postponed it. But the first thing that came to my mind was, now I got another 30 days I can go fix. And this brother that was out of the club now had became a Christian. And he came looking for me. And I didn't want to talk to him. I went to the house and I saw his car in the driveway. And then I said, oh no, here's this guy, he wants to talk about God. I don't want to talk about God right now. And I went to the laundromat where my aunt was at, and she says, Andy, go talk to him. He says he has something good for you. He has some good stuff. So I started thinking, well, maybe this guy's messing around again. So I go back to the house, and he started telling me. He says, hey, he says, you know what? He says, I heard that you went to court. He says, you don't have to go to jail. He says, there's a place I can take you, and they'll go to court with you, and they'll take you, they'll take you in, and you can stay with them. And I started telling him, I says, oh yeah, sure. I says, these Christian people are going to go to court with me, and the judge is going to release me to them. He says, yeah. He says, yeah. He says, you know what? He says, he'll do that. And I says, with my record? He says, yeah. I says, look, I says, that's not for me. I says, church is for good people. I says, not for people like me. I says, you know, I says, I don't know that much. I said, but I do know that if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And I says, and you know, I so know that when you take a life, that you're going to go to hell. And then he tells me, he says, Jesus came to forgive sinners. And I says, and what does that mean to me? And he says, don't you get it? He says, he came for sinners. He says, like us. And then he goes, remember who you did this stuff with. And he's a very hardcore person. And he was serving Jesus. And I seen Jesus had done a work in his life. As a matter of fact, if it wouldn't have been for him and his wife, I wouldn't be here in front of you doing this interview today. Because they came after me. When we were in the club, I ruined their wedding. They got married and ruined their wedding day. They didn't even see each other for 3 days. They got married and a big fight broke out in their wedding, and she cussed me out. Her brothers took her away. We took him, partied with him, and yet she forgave me of all that. And when they became Christians, they came looking for me to tell me that Jesus could change my life. And God knew exactly who to send. I wouldn't listen to anybody else. And so he took me to a Christian home. I believe that long before I cried with my voice, God heard the anguish of my heart. And I believe that in those days, those last couple of days, it seems like things got worse, but I believe that God was setting it up so that there was no more self left, that I could only go up. I was so far down, I could only go up. And when he took me to this home, as soon as I walked in there, I knew something inside of me. I knew that I had finally come to wherever it was that I needed to come to in life. And there, sitting there behind the desk, was a guy that used to be a hype, whose brother-in-law was a club member. And he used to try to bring him around, and I used to tell his brother-in-law, don't bring him around. I don't want no hypes around my house. That's the guy that was sitting behind the desk. And he's the one that told me the plan of salvation. and I accepted Jesus Christ into my life as my personal Lord and Savior on that day. My wife didn't want anything to do with me. I didn't want to face my club brothers because I felt like I failed them. I didn't want to face my family. But yet, at that very point, it's like a weight was taken off my shoulders or off my back. And I felt like everything was going to be okay. And I had already accepted that my wife was going to meet somebody else, get married, and have a husband which she deserved, and my kids were going to have a father that they deserved. And God started to do a work in my life. It took me 32 years to get the way I was. I knew it was going to take me a while to unravel all that. You know what's funny? When I was in the club and I was active, I used to do things. Somebody would die, and I'd get up there and I'd speak, and I wouldn't shut up. They used to make fun of me. They said, man, you're always preaching. But even back then, as I look back, I knew I had a calling to be a preacher, to be a minister. I pray that you keep your hand upon their families and their loved ones. I pray that you continue to provide for them, Lord. And I pray, Father, that my desire now is to go back into the enemy's camp and take back everything that he's stolen. God has blessed me richly. My wife and I will be celebrating 36 years of being married. My daughter and my son respect me. My club brothers have just received me back. Amen. I mean, it's just the love that I feel. They respect me. Everything that the enemy used to destroy, God has turned it around to the positive. And I remember going up north, and I was in Teen Challenge. And at Teen Challenge, I was going to be the final speaker on a rally that they had. And as I was sitting there waiting for them to call me up, I noticed two biker type guys come in, big guys, tattooed down with long hair, beards, everything. And something inside of me, I knew who they were. And then they went out. When they went out, they came back in, but there was a third guy with them. And they called me up, and I started sharing my testimony. And I could see movement in the crowd. And as this one individual was moving closer and closer, I stopped in the middle. I said, I'm going to blow my testimony here. I'm going to blow it big time. I didn't say that out loud, but inside my mind. And I asked everybody to stop, and I prayed. And I asked God to take control of every situation. And I asked God to help me to continue to bring him honor and glory. And after I prayed, I kept sharing my testimony. Then we had an altar call. And an evangelist came to me and he goes, Andy, there's a guy that needs to talk to you over here. And there's this guy looking up at me, and he's got tears in his eyes. And he says, there's something I have to tell you. And he pulls out a gun. And I tell him no. I says, I know already. I said, would you like to accept Jesus into your life? And he accepted the Lord into his life. He had come there to and take care of me. He ended up giving his life to Jesus. And it was really awesome because it was a test of faith for me. It was a challenge for me. Either I was going to really believe that God was going to see me through or not. And after that, I just kind of grew in the ministry. In 1991, I think it was, I got ordained as a minister. But I had been preaching and teaching. But finally, I got ordained. I was ordained. When I did get ordained, my club brothers came. They came to support me when I got ordained. My wife grabbed the microphone, made an announcement, and said, now he's not only able to marry, but bury also. So those of you that aren't married, it's time for you to get things right. And I got approached by a brother whose name was Milkman and his girlfriend Gloria, and they asked me to marry them. And now they're married, and their kids are involved in ministry, and they're living an effective life for Christ. We're in Fresno, in the city of Del Rey. God has blessed us with a church, with a parsonage on it. We have classrooms in the back. We just started an accredited Bible college. I'm known as Pastor Andy. It's really awesome to be the pastor of a small town, country little town in the country to be a pastor, and God requires that I pastor that community also, not just our church, not just the local church, but I'm also the pastor of that community. We were given a bar. The bar, we use it to give food and clothing out. I'm believing that God is going to raise up a ranch for ex-gang members, a home for women. In my relationship with my club, I mean, it's just a blessing to be involved with my club brothers. I go and I preach and officiate for their weddings, for their funerals, and done baby dedications and those kind of things. And they're open to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I'm mustering up as many Christians as I can to pray for the biker world. It's a challenge to live by faith, but God has been good and faithful through it all. I look back and I seen a young boy with a lot of hurt, a lot of damaged emotions, but I see a man that failed quite a bit, but I also see the grace and the mercy of our Lord Jesus Christ and what he's able to do. If I'm ever going to be remembered for anything, I want to be remembered for that God can use anybody. I want to be living proof that God can use anybody, that he's not a respecter of persons. He don't care who you are, what you've done, whether you have degrees or you've never gone to school or anything like that, that God can take a life and make you into somebody.
There are few things as intimidating as a group of tough motorcycle guys. But to me, there's nothing more intriguing, inviting, and powerful than the sight of just one of these on his knees seeking God. Andy told us that he wanted to dedicate his testimony to Big Al and Lorraine Aceves for leading him to Jesus. And he also wants you to know that God can restore and even reunite a family, and he can use torn lives to help others. We hope you're enjoying hearing about these incredible stories as much as we enjoy giving them to you. You know, the Bible refers to stories such as these as living epistles, stories read by all. Please email us. We love to hear from you, especially if you've never written before. You can reach us at damascusroads@tbn.org. And until next time, God bless.
Testify what your love has done for me. Hear me singing now. Precious, you've been faithful to me. Bring it home now.
Tonight's program has been sponsored by the Trinity Broadcasting Network. And only with your love gift of support can it stay on the air. So please write to TBN, PO Box A, Santa Ana, California, 92711, or email us at damascusroads@tbn.org.
Just wanna testify.